Well, that's a good point. I mean, as you know, um, recently there was a lot of talk about being inclusive within the G7 in terms of broadening the participation of non-permanent members. And I think this was an attempt. And as you mentioned, the three key countries in sub-Saharan Africa in terms of their economy, Nigeria, Ethiopia, and Kenya, were invited to be key players and obviously representing the broader continent. So the hope is that because these are larger economies, these are the countries, especially on the east coast of Africa. Kenya and Ethiopia have done very well. Ethiopia growing at 9%, Kenya at 5.5%, 6%. Nigeria, even despite the temporary, in my view, the temporary challenges it's facing with the recession, which will come out of this year, I think the G8 is trying to look further down and see when Nigeria, for example, can be fully re-engaged, when its economy is doing. But in my view, I think one of the reasons the G8 extended the invitation, and I don't think it's a coincidence, to the same two countries that were invited to the One Belt, One Road, is because I think they're trying to find the balance of who are the winning countries in Africa, and can we create a stronger partnership now. I mean, as you remember, a couple of weeks ago, there was this big, very successful event in Beijing called the One Belt, One Road, where the Chinese have committed to about $1 trillion over 10 years. And the two countries they invited to that event were Ethiopia and Kenya. And the G7 a couple of weeks later does the same thing with the addition of Nigeria and Niger from sub-Saharan Africa. I think there is, in my view, there seems to be a rivalry between the two sides, but I think for African countries, this is a pretty place to be in, to be courted by both sides. And so hopefully there will be some meaningful engagement by the G7, as was the case in the One Belt, One Road. One Belt, One Road had numbers attached to it, initiatives attached to a specific, and hopefully the G7 will be able to do the same thing.
Now, we do tend to see a lot of focus on the crisis itself as opposed to the underlying causes of the crisis, some of the economic reasons why people are choosing to leave a lot of these African countries. What is really being done to address those issues?
Well, I think the EU in particular, not the broader G7, but the EU in particular, because it is impacting the European Union more than, say, the United States, has come up with packages for African countries. I mean, last year they announced, for example, financing of economic activities in certain selected countries, in financing industrial parks, and also really to help at the source stop the migration into Europe. So they're trying to be innovative, but at the end of the day, what would stop migration, especially from some of these war-torn countries, countries in conflict, is to create opportunities right there at home. Aid is one thing, but I think ultimately what Africans, in my view, need, or would appreciate even more, is there's an economic engagement to make these young people in particular, which is mostly young people, to prevent them or to stop them from looking for what they think is, you know, the golden opportunity somewhere else, when in reality, if the investments are made right there in Africa, if the opportunities are expanded in Africa, I don't think that many young people will be living to Europe. And I think the Europeans have realized this, and the EU is putting, you know, I think hundreds of millions of dollars in economic activities into Africa, while they're still trying to, you know, stop at the border, but which is a very difficult initiative. Address the issue at the source, in places like Somalia and other places where there are a lot of young kids just want to leave Africa and go there. And that's what I think is going to happen now, is come up with innovative ways of addressing the issues at the source.
Now, that's one of several global issues that G7 leaders are going to be tackling this year. And we already saw some clashes between US President Donald Trump and his Western allies over things like free trade and the climate change agreement. And one EU leader even described this as one of the most challenging meetings of the G7 in years. What's your take on how things are actually going at the meeting so far?
So my take in particular on climate change, at least for those who operate in Africa, they know it's real. When you see one year El Nino, the next year La Nina, creating either drought or havoc in terms of flooding, you know this is not a normal pattern. So it needs to be addressed. And I think this is where the G7 could be an equal partner of Africa by providing the knowledge, the know-how, and more importantly, the financing that need, for example, on carbon trading and other initiatives. I'll give you a very example. Actually, some of these emerging economies in Africa are far ahead of the developed world. I mean, if I take Ethiopia, 98% of Ethiopia's energy is renewable from hydro, solar. So I think what the G7 and certainly the United States should be able to do is engage the African countries where they're ahead of the curve. They don't pollute as much, and they're willing to invest in renewable energy. As I said, geothermal, solar, hydro, all these other things. So whereas the knowledge and the financing is readily available in the developed world, in the G7, the United States. And I think my view is that let's really get real. Let's say climate change is real, okay? And therefore engage these countries because we see it. I mean, as an investor in Africa, I certainly see it every day, that it has an impact. And it's not something, I don't think it's somebody created out of the thin air. So my suggestion to the G7 and certainly to the United States, a very wealthy country which can afford to provide, and the US also has the technology, not just the financing. I think it should engage African countries to help them actually sustain the innovation that they have in renewable energy.